What if the dead never truly slept, and what we unearthed proves it? From bodies buried with their eyes open to ancient graves, designed to trap souls in eternal unrest, these archaeological discoveries will haunt your sleep tonight. Subscribe now, because once you hear these stories, closing your eyes will never feel the same. The skeleton lay curled on its side, ribs collapsed inward, fingers frozen in a rigid claw around a small corroded bell. At first glance it looked like a grave good, another sentimental object placed with the dead. But as the dirt was brushed away and the bell's thin metal tongue became visible, the room went quiet. This was not an offering. This was a warning. Or perhaps a plea. Across history, humans have feared many things about death, judgment, darkness, oblivion. But one terror stands out as uniquely intimate and suffocating: the fear of being buried alive while asleep, trapped in a coffin with no voice, no light, and no escape. The bell clutched in that skeleton's hand was not meant for the afterlife. It was meant for the living. Long before modern medicine could reliably declare death, the boundary between sleep, coma, unconsciousness, and death was dangerously thin. A person could fall into a deep sleep or catatonic state, breathe so shallowly it was imperceptible, their pulse faint enough to vanish beneath untrained fingers. In such moments, the body mimicked death so convincingly that even loved ones were fooled. And once buried, there would be no second chances, unless the dead could somehow announce they were still alive. That is where the bells come in. In graves across Europe and parts of Asia, archaeologists have uncovered skeletons with bells placed in their hands, attached to strings or positioned near their mouths. In some cases, thin wires run from the coffin to the surface, where a small bell would have once hung above the grave. The idea was simple and horrifying. If the person woke up underground, they could ring the bell and signal for help. But the skeletons tell a darker story. Many of the bells are found still clutched tightly, as if grasped in desperation. Some skeletons show scratches on the inside of coffins, fingernail marks etched into wood. Others are twisted into unnatural positions, bones displaced in ways that suggest frantic movement long after burial. These are not peaceful deaths. These are records of panic, of awakening in absolute darkness, realizing too late that sleep had betrayed them. Sleep, in this context, was not rest. It was a mask worn by death. Before the advent of stethoscopes, electrocardiograms, and brain activity monitoring, declaring someone dead was often based on crude tests: a mirror held to the mouth, a candle flame watched for flickers, a feather placed beneath the nose. If nothing moved, death was assumed. But deep sleep, hypothermia, certain illnesses, and neurological conditions could slow the body to near stillness. There are documented cases of people returning to life hours or even days after being pronounced dead, sometimes during funerals, sometimes after burial preparations had already begun. These stories spread like wildfire through communities, feeding an already primal fear. Sleep became suspect. Deep sleep became dangerous. The longer someone slept, the more uneasy people grew. What if they weren't sleeping at all? What if they were already gone, or worse? What if they were trapped somewhere in between? The bell was meant to solve that uncertainty. It was humanity's compromise with death: we will bury you, but we will give you one last chance to scream. And yet, the archaeological record suggests that chance was rarely enough. In some graves, bells are found with no visible path to the surface, suggesting the belief was more symbolic than practical. The dead were given the illusion of safety, a comfort for those left behind rather than a real rescue mechanism. In others, the bells are intact but unreachable, placed in stiffened hands that could not move once rigor mortis set in. The intention was there, but the execution failed, condemning the sleeper to silence. Perhaps most chilling are the graves where the bell is found displaced, fallen from the skeleton's grip, resting near the chest or jaw. These bells were rung, not enough to be heard, not enough to save them, but enough to leave behind a final, terrible question: how long were they awake? Sleep has always been a rehearsal for death. The body lies still, the mind drifts, consciousness fades. Ancient cultures recognized this resemblance and feared it. To sleep deeply was to flirt with the grave. To oversleep was to risk never waking at all. In that context, being buried with a bell was not paranoia. It was preparation. Some cultures took the fear even further. Bells were sometimes placed not in the hand but sewn into burial shrouds, tied near the throat, or positioned above the chest. The idea was that even involuntary movement, a gasp, a twitch, a final reflex might set the bell ringing. The dead would not need to think. Their body would betray the truth, but bodies fail. Bells corrode. Earth presses down. Sound dies quickly underground. What remains are the bones and the stories they silently tell. One excavation revealed a coffin where the skeleton's arm was raised unnaturally high, elbow bent sharply upward, as though the person had tried to reach the lid. The bell was found inches from the hand, no longer attached. The lid above was splintered from the inside. That person did not die peacefully in their sleep. They woke up. They knew where they were. They tried to escape. Sleep, in that moment, became a curse. The terror of premature burial seeped into folklore, literature, and collective imagination. Tales of sleepers awakening in coffins haunted communities for centuries. The bell became a symbol not just of safety, but of helplessness. Proof that even with precautions, the grave could still win. What makes these archaeological finds especially disturbing is not just the fear they represent, but how rational that fear was. This was not superstition. It was a response to lived experience. People had seen neighbors declared dead who later moved. They had heard stories of coffins reopening, of graves disturbed from within. They knew that sleep could deceive, and so they armed the dead with bells. Yet archaeology shows us the uncomfortable truth: the bells rarely changed the outcome. The earth swallowed sound. Time ran out. The sleepers did not wake in time, or they woke when no one was listening. In some interpretations, the bells were not meant to save the buried at all, but to protect the living. If the dead woke, the bell would warn the community, not so they could rescue the sleeper, but so they could stay away. In this view, the bell was less a lifeline and more an alarm, proof that something unnatural had occurred. The dead had crossed back over, and that was dangerous. This idea blurs the line between fear of being buried alive and fear of the undead. Sleep again sits at the center. A person who wakes after burial is neither fully alive nor fully dead. They are something else. Something wrong. The skeleton with the bell becomes a liminal figure, trapped between states, ringing not for help but for acknowledgement. When archaeologists encounter these graves today, the emotional impact is immediate. Bones are bones, but context gives them voice. A bell in a hand is a sentence frozen in time: I might wake up. Please listen. It forces us to confront how fragile certainty once was, how easily sleep could be mistaken for death, how final decisions were made with incomplete knowledge, and how terror shaped ritual. Modern viewers often recoil at these finds, comforted by the idea that such fears are obsolete. We have machines now, monitors, flat lines, and brain scans. We believe we know when someone is truly gone, and yet the unease lingers. Stories of coma patients awakening, of misdiagnosed deaths, of people coming back after hours without signs of life. The bell may be gone, but the fear remains. Sleep is still a mystery. Consciousness still slips away each night without guarantee of return. The skeleton clutching the bell reminds us that for much of human history, falling asleep carried an existential risk. Not just the risk of dying, but of dying wrongly, of being sealed into darkness while still dreaming, still breathing, still hoping someone might hear. The bell was humanity's last defense against that nightmare. And the fact that we keep finding them, silent and rusted in graves, suggests that in many cases no one ever did. The skull stared back long after the rest of the body had surrendered to soil. Its eye sockets were not empty, as centuries of decay would normally leave them. Instead, each hollow was crammed full with rough stones, pressed in so tightly they seemed fused to bone. Whoever placed them there did not do so gently. The stones were forced, wedged with intention, as if the dead had once resisted being made to see. Archaeologists encountering such skulls often describe an immediate sense of unease. There is something profoundly wrong about a face that cannot close its eyes. In life, sleep is a mercy, an escape, a surrender, a temporary death that the body trusts it will return from. To deny that state to the dead is to suggest a fear that goes far beyond burial rites. It implies that sleep itself was dangerous, even after death, and that whatever lay beyond the grave might still require vigilance. In many ancient cultures, the eyes were not merely organs of sight. They were gateways. Through them the soul perceived the world. Through them spirits could enter or escape. Closing the eyes in death was an act of trust. Trust that the soul would move on, that the body would rest, that nothing would come back. For some societies, that trust did not exist. Skulls with stones wedged into eye sockets have been uncovered in burial sites, scattered across different regions and eras, often with no written record to explain the practice. The consistency of the act, however, tells its own story. This was not random desecration. It was ritualized fear. The stones themselves vary. In some cases they are smooth river pebbles, selected carefully, almost reverently. In others they are jagged shards, broken rock forced into place with enough pressure to crack the delicate orbital bone. The choice matters. Smooth stones suggest control, a measured act meant to seal rather than punish. Jagged ones suggest urgency, violence, perhaps even panic. As though the dead were perceived as an immediate threat, the intention behind forcing the eyes open appears paradoxical. One might assume that closing the eyes would prevent the dead from seeing, from watching, from returning. But these burials do the opposite. They compel eternal wakefulness. The dead are not allowed to rest. They are condemned to an endless, unblinking state, staring into darkness forever. This suggests a chilling belief that sleep empowers the dead. In life, sleep is when the mind wanders beyond the body. Dreams blur boundaries. The unconscious moves freely, unconstrained by physical law. Ancient people noticed this. They dreamed of the dead. They saw loved ones appear in sleep, speaking, warning, demanding. Nightmares felt invasive, external, as though something had entered the sleeper's mind. Over time, sleep became associated with vulnerability. Not just to dreams but to spirits. If the living were vulnerable in sleep, what of the dead? Some cultures believed that death was not a clean break, but a prolonged transition. The soul lingered, it hovered near the body, uncertain of where to go. During this liminal period, sleep could allow the soul to drift back into the world of the living, slipping through dreams, possessing bodies, feeding on breath and warmth. A sleeping dead person, then, was dangerous. By forcing the eyes open, the dead were denied that transition. They were pinned to awareness. They could not dream. They could not wander. They could not rest enough to rise. The stones were anchors. There is also the belief that the dead could see through closed eyelids. Sleep, again, becomes key. If the eyes closed, the dead might turn inward, focusing not on the grave but on the living world beyond it. Open eyes forced the gaze outward, into nothingness, trapping attention where there was nothing to act upon. Some skulls show additional signs of restraint. Jawbones wired shut, limbs pinned with stones, bodies buried face down. These were not honors. They were precautions. The dead were being controlled. The eye stones are among the most intimate of these measures. To touch the eyes is deeply personal. Even in modern times, it feels invasive. For ancient people to do this routinely suggests terror strong enough to override taboo. Sleep again sits at the center of that terror. In some mythologies, the dead who returned were described as having hungry eyes or dreaming eyes. They watched sleepers. They waited for moments of weakness. Night was their domain. The act of denying the dead sleep may have been an attempt to break this cycle, to ensure that whatever consciousness remained after death would never gain the power that comes with dreaming. Archaeological context adds another layer. Many of these skulls are found in mass graves or marginal burial sites, separate from normal cemeteries. This suggests the individuals buried this way were considered dangerous even before death. They may have been accused of witchcraft, cursed illnesses, strange behavior, or prophetic dreams. Anything that blurred the line between waking and dreaming could mark a person as suspect. Once dead, that suspicion did not fade. It intensified. The stones in the eyes ensured that the person's identity, as someone connected to dreams, to visions, to the unseen, would be neutralized. Even in death, they were not trusted. Some researchers propose that the stones were meant to block the soul from re-entering the body through the eyes. In this interpretation, sleep is not rest but an open door. The eyes, closed in sleep, become portals inward. By jamming them open and filling them, those portals were sealed permanently. The dead would not wake, but more importantly, they would not return. Yet the cruelty of the practice suggests another fear, that the dead might still be aware. Imagine the belief system required for this ritual to make sense. It assumes that after death, there is consciousness, that the dead can feel, see, think, that they can experience boredom, frustration, longing, and then it deliberately condemns them to an eternity without sleep, without darkness behind the eyes, without relief. This is not mercy, it is containment. In some skulls, the stones show wear patterns, as though they were adjusted after placement, pressed deeper, repositioned. This suggests that the burial was not a single moment but a process. The living may have returned to the grave, fearful that the dead were not properly secured. Perhaps someone dreamed of them. Perhaps someone fell ill. Dreams and sickness often reinforced each other in ancient belief systems. If something went wrong after burial, the solution was not coincidence, it was ritual correction. The dead were blamed. Sleep deprivation is a form of torture. Ancient people may not have understood it scientifically, but they understood it experientially. A person who cannot sleep becomes disoriented, weakened, less capable of action. Applying that logic to the dead makes grim sense. Keep them awake forever, and they will lose whatever power they might have had. The stones were a sentence. There is also an unsettling symbolic interpretation, that the dead were being forced to watch over the living. Eternal sentinels, eyes propped open, unable to look away. In this reading, the practice reflects guilt rather than fear. The living needed witnesses. Ancestors who could not sleep might guard the community, watching for threats from beyond. But even this interpretation carries darkness. Guardians who cannot rest are prisoners. What is consistent across all interpretations is the association between sleep and danger. Sleep allows movement between worlds. Sleep weakens boundaries. Sleep is when rules break, by denying sleep to the dead. Ancient people were attempting to stabilize reality itself. Modern observers often assume that such practices were driven by ignorance or superstition, but fear of sleep-related vulnerability persists today. Sleep paralysis, nightmares, recurring dreams of the dead. These experiences still unsettle us because they feel external, invasive, uncontrollable. We wake unsure of where the dream ended and waking began. Ancient people lived in that uncertainty constantly. They did not have the luxury of dismissing dreams as neurological noise. Dreams carried messages, warnings, commands. If the dead appeared in dreams, it meant something. And if they appeared too often, something was wrong. The skulls with stone-filled eyes are physical manifestations of that anxiety. They are attempts to control the unseen using the seen, to solve metaphysical terror with material force. Stone does not dream. Stone does not sleep. Stone is final, and yet the skull remains human. The image of those forced open eyes lingers because it reverses the natural order. We close the eyes to rest. We close them in death. We close them to escape the world. To pry them open and stuff them with rock is to say you do not get to escape. You do not get peace. You do not get the mercy of sleep. It is a punishment that assumes awareness long after life has ended. And that assumption is the most haunting part. These skulls suggest that ancient people believed death did not end experience, it altered it. The dead could suffer. They could long. They could watch. And because they could watch, they could interfere. So the eyes were filled, not to blind but to control, not to honor but to restrain, not to protect the dead, but to protect the living from what the dead might do if allowed to close their eyes and dream. In the end, the skull stares into eternity, stones where vision once lived. It will never sleep. It will never dream. It will never look inward again. And that may have been exactly the point. The figure looms in charcoal and ochre, its limbs elongated beyond human proportion, its head a blur of horns or smoke or shadow. Beneath it lies a smaller shape, unmistakably human, stretched flat arms pinned, chest crushed under an invisible weight. The sleeper's mouth is open, frozen in a silent cry. This image appears on cave walls thousands of years old, carved into stone slabs etched into bone and clay across continents that never touched. Different cultures, different eras, the same terror. Sleep paralysis demons existed long before the term sleep paralysis ever did, long before neuroscience, before medicine, before written language. Humans were already trying to explain a horrifying experience that felt supernatural, invasive, and deeply personal. Waking in the night, unable to move, unable to speak, feeling a crushing weight on the chest, sensing a presence in the room that should not be there, the body paralyzed, the mind awake, fear absolute. What makes this phenomenon especially unsettling is not just its universality, but its consistency. Across civilizations separated by oceans and millennia, people described the same thing. And more disturbingly, they drew it. In Paleolithic cave art, archaeologists have found scenes that do not depict hunting, animals, or daily life, but something far stranger. Human figures lie flat or reclined, eyes wide, limbs stiff. Above them hover dark shapes, amorphous, often faceless, sometimes with claws, sometimes with distorted limbs. These beings press down, crouch on chests, lean close to faces. The posture is unmistakable. Anyone who has experienced sleep paralysis recognizes it immediately. This is not coincidence. For early humans, sleep was not a neutral state. It was dangerous. When you slept, you were defenseless. Predators attacked at night. Fires died. Guards failed. And worse than physical threats were the invisible ones, the things that came only when the eyes closed. Dreams felt real. Nightmares felt external. And sleep paralysis felt like an attack. Without scientific explanation, the only possible conclusion was that something was entering the body during sleep, something external, something intentional. The art reflects this belief. In some cave paintings, the shadow figure is shown with exaggerated weight, its body pressing downward, compressing the sleeper's torso. This aligns perfectly with one of the most common sensations reported during sleep paralysis: an intense pressure on the chest, as though something heavy is sitting on you, preventing breath. Ancient artists did not need anatomy textbooks to know where fear lived. They drew the sensation exactly where it was felt. Other carvings show the sleeper's mouth open, tongue extended, eyes bulging. This reflects another common feature: the feeling of suffocation, of trying to scream and being unable to produce sound. The art does not show movement, it shows helplessness. What is perhaps most disturbing is how similar these depictions are across cultures that never shared myths, languages, or trade routes. In Europe, medieval carvings show a squat, dark creature crouched on a sleeper's chest. In East Asia, ancient scrolls and carvings depict shadowy women or demons hovering over paralyzed bodies at night. In parts of Africa, rock art shows elongated spirits bending over prone humans. In the Americas, pre-Columbian art portrays night beings stealing breath from sleepers. Different names, same posture, same fear. The demon is always close, too close. Anthropologists once assumed these similarities came from cultural diffusion, stories passed along trade routes. But the oldest examples predate such connections. The only shared factor is the human nervous system. Sleep paralysis occurs when the brain wakes before the body does. During REM sleep, the brain paralyzes the body to prevent acting out dreams. When consciousness returns before paralysis fades, the result is a waking nightmare. The sleeper is trapped between worlds. Ancient people did not know this. They only knew that something sat on them at night. The mind, desperate for explanation, supplied one. These experiences were not rare. They were common enough, terrifying enough, and vivid enough to demand representation. Cave walls were not decoration, they were communication. Teaching tools, warnings, records of encounters with forces beyond the ordinary. When a community saw these images, they understood what they meant. They had felt it too. Sleep paralysis demons were not metaphorical. They were real entities in the worldview of early humans. They explained why strong hunters woke screaming, why healthy people died suddenly in their sleep, why some refused to sleep alone, why night was feared even in safe caves. In some carvings, the demon has exaggerated eyes or a distorted face, suggesting intense staring. Many modern sufferers report feeling watched during paralysis, even before seeing anything. The art captures this paranoia, the sense of being observed, judged, targeted. In others, the demon has claws digging into the sleeper's chest or throat. This reflects the sensation of pressure shifting, tightening, becoming painful. People today still describe scratch-like sensations, choking, hands around the neck. Ancient art did not shy away from these details. Some figures are partially transparent, half-formed, blending into the rock. This mirrors the shadow-like quality reported in paralysis hallucinations. The entity is seen, but not clearly. It flickers, it feels wrong. What is remarkable is that these artists were not trying to scare for entertainment. Horror as a genre did not exist. These images were attempts at understanding and control. By naming the thing, by giving it shape, by carving it into stone, people believed they could contain it. Art became defense. In certain cultures, specific rituals emerged to ward off these beings. Amulets were placed near sleeping areas. Protective symbols were painted near beds. Certain sleeping positions were discouraged. Sleeping on the back, in particular, was often associated with attack. Another eerie parallel, as sleep paralysis is more likely to occur when lying supine. The art reinforced these rules. It showed what happened if you slept incorrectly, if you disrespected the night, if you failed to protect yourself. Over time, these images evolved into mythology. The demons gained names, personalities, backstories, but their core behavior never changed. They came at night. They pressed down. They stole breath. They froze bodies. In medieval Europe, this became the night hag. In Japan, the Kanashibari spirit. In Newfoundland, the old hag. In Brazil, the pisadera. In each case, the being does the same thing depicted on cave walls tens of thousands of years earlier. The art did not create the experience. The experience created the art. Some archaeologists suggest that these depictions may have served a social function beyond fear. Sleep paralysis often occurs during times of stress, illness, or trauma. Early communities dealing with famine, violence, or environmental instability may have experienced it more frequently. The demon became a way to externalize collective anxiety. It was easier to blame a night spirit than confront internal fragility. But this explanation does not diminish the terror. If anything, it deepens it. Imagine waking in the night, unable to move, certain you are about to die, and knowing that your ancestors carved this exact moment into stone because it happened to them too. The realization would not comfort you. It would confirm that this thing has always been there. Some cave paintings even show multiple figures watching a single sleeper. This may reflect episodes where paralysis hallucinations include more than one presence. Or it may reflect communal fear, the idea that the night is crowded with unseen watchers. The demons are rarely depicted attacking during the day. They belong exclusively to sleep, to the vulnerable hours, to the moments when the mind drifts and defenses fall. This reinforces a terrifying conclusion drawn by ancient people. The danger does not come from outside the cave. It comes from within the body itself, from sleep. Sleep opens the door. Art historians note that many of these depictions are placed in liminal cave spaces, not deep sanctuaries, not open entrances, but transitional zones, places between light and dark. This placement mirrors the experience itself, trapped between waking and dreaming. The environment reflects the state of mind. Even as civilizations advanced, these images persisted. They moved from caves to temples, from stone to parchment. The demon's shape changed, but its function did not. It remained a symbol of the moment when control is lost. Modern science now explains sleep paralysis in clinical terms: neurotransmitters, REM intrusion, muscle atonia. But explanation has not erased fear. People still describe the experience in supernatural language. They still see shadows. They still feel presences. The ancient art suddenly feels less primitive and more observational. Those early artists were not ignorant. They were documenting a human constant. When we look at these cave paintings today, the discomfort we feel is not just aesthetic. It is recognition. The art reaches across time and touches a memory buried in the nervous system. A memory of waking in terror, pinned, watched, crushed. The demons in the art are not inventions. They are interpretations of something real, filtered through belief and fear. They remind us that sleep is not passive. It is active. It is powerful. And when it goes wrong, it can feel like an invasion. That is why these images endure. They are proof that long before we named sleep paralysis, long before we explained it away, humans were already haunted by it and already trying to warn each other. The walls still whisper the same message when you sleep: you are not always alone. The grave was aligned with precision, but not toward hope. Its long axis pointed away from the eastern horizon, away from the place where the sun would rise each morning. When archaeologists first noticed the pattern, it seemed like an error and inconsistency in burial customs. But the pattern repeated itself again and again. Entire burial grounds turned their backs on dawn. This was not carelessness. It was fear. Across many ancient cultures, sunrise was not simply the beginning of a new day. It was an act of power. Light did not just reveal the world, it animated it. It awakened animals, stirred the living, warmed the earth, and, in some belief systems, had the ability to rouse what should remain still. For people who believed that death was not final, that spirits lingered, watched, and waited, the rising sun posed a terrifying risk. Light could wake the dead. To modern minds, burial orientation may seem symbolic at best, decorative at worst. But to ancient societies, direction mattered. East and West were not neutral coordinates, they were forces. The East was birth, renewal, beginnings. The West was endings, decay, and descent. The sun's daily journey mirrored life itself, rising into existence, sinking into death. To face the dead toward the dawn was to invite reversal. Some cultures embraced this. Others recoiled from it. In burial sites where graves face away from the sunrise, the message is unmistakable: do not wake up. These graves often belong to individuals marked as dangerous, powerful, or unsettled in life. Shaman seers. Those who died suddenly, violently, or under suspicious circumstances. In some cases, entire communities oriented all their graves away from dawn, suggesting a collective anxiety rather than isolated fear. The dead were not trusted. Not fully. Not ever. The belief was simple and terrifying: light brings consciousness. Darkness keeps things quiet. Sleep again becomes central to this worldview. Night was when spirits roamed, but it was also when they rested. Dawn disrupted that balance. Just as the living woke with the sun, so too might the dead stir in their graves if exposed to its first rays. The transition between night and day was dangerous. Boundaries weakened. Worlds brushed against each other. By burying the dead facing away from the sunrise, ancient people attempted to deny them that moment of awakening. The grave became a permanent night. Even when the sun rose, its light would strike the back of the head, the spine, the feet, never the face. The dead would not see the dawn. They would not feel its call. This was not about comfort. It was about containment. In some archaeological sites, graves facing away from dawn are also deeper, heavier, reinforced with stones or weighted with slabs. The orientation was only one layer of defense. The earth itself was enlisted as a barrier. Light, air, movement, everything that suggested awakening, was minimized. The fear was not abstract. Many cultures believed that spirits retained awareness after death. They could hear, they could see. They could grow restless. A restless spirit was dangerous. It brought illness, bad dreams, crop failure, sudden death. Keeping the dead asleep was a form of community protection. Sleep in this context was not rest. It was sedation. Ancient myths often describe the dead as dormant rather than gone. They lie in shadowed realms, waiting, dreaming, or trapped in half-awareness. Sunrise, associated with gods, renewal, and rebirth, threatened to disturb that dormancy. If the sun could revive crops and animals, why not souls? Some burial rituals explicitly mention turning the dead from the light. Bodies were rotated, adjusted, even reburied if orientation was deemed incorrect. In certain cultures, if misfortune followed a burial, the solution was not prayer but realignment. The dead were turned further from dawn, as if correcting their line of sight would calm them. This suggests a deeply physical understanding of spirituality. The dead were not abstract presences. They were bodies in the ground, subject to forces like light, heat, and direction. If those forces could affect the living, they could affect the dead too. In some traditions, sunrise was the moment souls might attempt to return. Dreams at dawn were considered especially dangerous. The living were warned not to sleep past sunrise, lest wandering spirits find them vulnerable. The dead, buried beneath the earth, were thought to be listening for the same signal. Light was an invitation. The graves that face away from it are refusals. Archaeologists have noted that these burial grounds often lack grave goods associated with comfort or journeying. No food, no tools, no symbolic guides. Instead, the focus is on stillness, finality. The dead are not being prepared for travel. They are being put away. This contrasts sharply with cultures that buried their dead facing east, toward the rising sun, welcoming rebirth or resurrection. The difference is not technological or chronological. It is psychological. It reveals how differently communities related to their dead, either as ancestors to be honored or as forces to be restrained. Where fear dominated, dawn became an enemy. The orientation also affected the living. Burial grounds were often placed where the first light of day would not strike them directly. Hills, forests, or artificial barriers blocked sunrise. People avoided looking at graves at dawn. Children were warned away. The moment of sunrise belonged to the living alone. This separation mattered. The idea that light awakens spirits also explains why some cultures feared reflections, mirrors, or water at sunrise. These surfaces doubled the light, multiplied its reach. A spirit seeing itself in reflected dawn might realize it was dead or worse, realize it was not. Confusion between sleep and death haunted ancient minds. People slipped into comas, trances, fevers. They woke after being thought dead. They dreamed of walking among the living. They spoke of journeys taken while their bodies lay still. Sunrise, marking the return of consciousness, symbolized all of this uncertainty. If sleep could resemble death, death might resemble sleep, and if the dead were merely sleeping, dawn could wake them. The graves facing away from the sun are attempts to lock the dead into night forever. Some skeletons in these graves show signs of binding or restraint. Arms crossed tightly, jaws secured, stones placed near the head. Orientation was not enough. The body itself had to be positioned correctly, aligned to prevent movement. The head especially mattered. The face was the seat of identity, awareness, recognition. Turning it from the light was symbolic and practical. Do not see. Do not recognize. Do not return. The repetition of this practice over generations suggests that it worked, or at least that people believed it did. When communities experienced peace, when crops grew and sickness stayed away, burial customs were reinforced. When disaster struck, they were intensified. Fear shaped tradition. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to dismiss these beliefs as superstition, but they were rooted in lived experience. Nightmares, sleep paralysis, visions of the dead at dawn, the strange feeling of waking as light creeps into the room when dreams cling stubbornly to reality. Ancient people felt this too. Without the language to separate physiology from the supernatural, they trusted their senses, and their senses told them that light changes things. Even today, we speak of waking the dead, of bringing something to light, of restless spirits. Language preserves old fears. Sunrise still feels symbolic. Hospitals track deaths and births by time. Dawn feels like a threshold. The graves facing away from it stand as quiet testimony to a belief that some thresholds are better left uncrossed. The dead were not meant to rise with the sun. They were meant to stay asleep, and so they were buried facing away from dawn, turned from the promise of morning, sealed into eternal night. Not for their sake, but for ours. The amulet was small, almost easy to miss, nestled beside the skull as if it had fallen there by accident. It was carved from bone or stone or metal worn thin by time, etched with symbols that no longer translate cleanly into any known language. It was not decorative. It was not a gift. It was placed with purpose close to the head, close to where dreams were believed to live. In many ancient cultures, dreams were not fleeting thoughts or harmless illusions. They were entities, forces, things that moved. To dream was not simply to imagine, but to travel, to open oneself, to release something from within the body that could wander beyond control. And when the body died, that danger did not disappear. It intensified. The dead, people believed, did not stop dreaming. Death was often understood as a kind of permanent sleep, deeper and more dangerous than any the living experienced. If dreams could escape the living body at night, what might escape a dead one, unguarded, uncontained, no longer tethered by breath or blood? The answer terrified ancient people enough to bury protections directly beside the skull. Nightmare protection charms were not meant to comfort the dead. They were meant to protect the living. The belief was simple, but chilling dreams were not always loyal to the dreamer. Some dreams, especially nightmares, had agency. They could slip free. They could roam. They could infect others. A dead body no longer able to wake could become a breeding ground for these hostile dreams, releasing them into the world like invisible predators. The amulet was a seal. Archaeologists have found these charms placed deliberately near the mouth, the eyes, the temples, anywhere dreams were thought to exit the body. Some were tied to jawbones. Others were pressed against the forehead or tucked beneath the skull. Placement mattered. Dreams followed paths. The charm had to block them. In certain burial sites, the same type of amulet appears repeatedly, suggesting standardized designs passed down through generations. These were not improvised solutions. They were the result of long-held fear, reinforced by experience, by stories of nights gone wrong. People dreamed of the dead, not metaphorically but vividly. The dead appeared angry, distorted, repeating the same images night after night. Entire households shared similar nightmares after a burial. Children screamed in their sleep. Adults woke gasping, convinced something had brushed past them in the dark. These patterns demanded explanation. The explanation became tradition. Nightmares were thought to be contagious. A bad dream could move from one sleeper to another, riding breath, shadow, or thought. If someone died during a time of intense dreaming, after illness, trauma, violence, their dreams were considered especially dangerous. Those dreams had momentum. Without a living mind to contain them, they would seek new hosts. The skull was the doorway. In life, the body wakes and shuts the door. In death, the door stays open. Amulets were crafted to close it. The designs etched into these charms often feature repeating loops, knots, spirals, or closed shapes, symbols of containment. Nothing escapes. Nothing enters. The loop has no end. Some charms depict eyes crossed out, mouths sealed, or abstract representations of barriers. Even without knowing the exact symbolic language, the intention is unmistakable: stop movement. Material choice also mattered. Bone from animals associated with protection, stones believed to absorb energy, metals thought to repel spirits. Each culture selected what they trusted most to resist the unseen. What is especially disturbing is that many of these charms show signs of wear before burial. They were used in life. This suggests that the person buried with them was already considered vulnerable to dangerous dreams. Perhaps they suffered from nightmares, visions, or sleep paralysis. Perhaps they were known as someone whose dreams leaked, whose sleep disturbed others. Death did not erase that reputation, it confirmed it. To bury someone with a nightmare charm was to acknowledge that even in death, they posed a risk. The idea that dreams could escape after death reflects a belief that the mind outlives the body, at least temporarily. Consciousness lingers. Thoughts continue. Images replay themselves endlessly in the dark. Without waking to interrupt them, dreams become permanent. And permanent nightmares are unbearable. Some cultures believed that if nightmares escaped a corpse, they could attach themselves to the nearest living person, especially relatives. This created a cycle of inherited fear. Families plagued by bad dreams blamed their dead. Ancestors became threats rather than protectors. The amulet broke that chain. In some graves, multiple charms are found clustered around the skull, suggesting extra precautions. This may indicate that the deceased died under particularly disturbing circumstances: murder, suicide, sudden illness, or intense psychological distress. Trauma was believed to poison dreams, making them sharper, more aggressive. A traumatized dead person was a nightmare factory. The living responded with layers of defense. It is important to understand that these beliefs did not arise from ignorance alone. They arose from patterns. People noticed correlations between death and disturbed sleep. They noticed that nightmares spiked after funerals, that certain deaths led to prolonged periods of terror in a household. Without modern psychology, the conclusion was logical: something from the dead was causing it. Dreams were the medium. Sleep was the vulnerability, the charm was the solution. Some amulets were inscribed with prayers or commands, not addressed to gods but to the dreams themselves, instructions to stay, to sleep, to remain with the body. This implies that dreams were seen as semi-autonomous, capable of obedience if properly addressed. Others were deliberately ugly, asymmetrical, or unsettling in design. These were meant to frighten the nightmares back into the skull, much like scarecrows ward off birds. The dead dream would encounter the charm and recoil. The proximity to the skull is key. Dreams were believed to originate in the head, not the heart. Even cultures that associated emotion with the chest placed nightmare charms near the brain. The mind was the source of danger. This belief aligns eerily with modern understanding. Dreams are neurological. They arise in the brain. They intrude into waking consciousness when boundaries fail. Ancient people did not know the science, but they knew the effect. When boundaries fail, terror follows. The amulets represent an attempt to reinforce those boundaries after death. Some burial sites show that charms were added after the initial burial. Graves reopened. Skulls disturbed. New amulets placed. This suggests that if nightmares continued after death, further intervention was required. The dead were blamed again and again until peace returned. Imagine the emotional weight of this: grief mixed with fear, love tangled with suspicion. To believe that a loved one's dreams were harming you after death required both closeness and desperation. The charm was a compromise. You did not destroy the body. You did not banish the spirit entirely. You simply contained the dreams. Let them sleep forever. In some cultures, nightmare charms were removed after a certain period, once the dead were believed to have settled. This suggests that dreams eventually faded, losing power over time. Death, like sleep, progressed through stages. The danger was greatest early on. Other cultures believed the opposite, that dreams grew stronger the longer the dead slept. In those cases, charms were permanent, heavy, sometimes even fused to the skull. The archaeological record shows both approaches, reflecting different relationships with death itself. What remains constant is the fear of uncontrolled imagination. Dreams ignore rules, they blur identities, they resurrect the past, they create realities that feel real enough to kill. Ancient people respected this power. They feared it. They planned for it. The idea that nightmares could escape a dead body may sound fantastical, but it speaks to a deeper truth humans have always struggled to contain: the mind. Even today, nightmares feel invasive, external, as though they attack us rather than originate within us. We speak of being haunted by dreams. The language has not changed. The amulet beside the skull is an ancient attempt to exorcise that haunting. When archaeologists lift these charms from the earth, they are not just uncovering artifacts. They are uncovering a worldview in which sleep, death, and imagination were dangerously intertwined, where the boundary between inner and outer worlds was thin and fragile. To die was not to stop dreaming, and to dream without a body to wake you was to risk unleashing something that should never roam free. So the charm was placed quietly, carefully, close to the skull, to keep the nightmares where they belonged. The tablet was small enough to fit in 2 hands, its edges rounded smooth by careful shaping rather than time. Pressed into the clay were lines of symbols arranged rhythmically, repeating patterns that rose and fell like breath. At first glance, it looked like a prayer, but when scholars began to recognize the cadence, the spacing, the intentional repetition, a far more unsettling interpretation emerged. This was not a prayer for the dead, it was a lullaby, and it was buried with a child. In graves across several ancient cultures, archaeologists have uncovered clay tablets, thin plaques, and inscribed shards placed deliberately near the heads or chests of children. The markings are not administrative. They are not names or dates, they are songs, soft words, repeated phrases, instructions meant to be spoken gently, endlessly, without variation, songs designed not to wake but to keep asleep forever. To modern sensibilities, the idea is heartbreaking. A lullaby is one of the most intimate gifts an adult gives a child. It is safety, routine, reassurance whispered into darkness. To engrave one into clay and bury it with a child suggests grief so deep it hardened into ritual. But beneath that tenderness lies something darker, something shaped by fear rather than love. Ancient people did not view children's sleep the way we do now. Sleep was not simply rest, it was a threshold. Children, especially infants, were believed to exist closer to the other side than adults. They drifted easily into sleep. They dreamed deeply. They woke crying at nothing. They stared into corners. They laughed in the dark. To ancient minds, these behaviors were not random. They were signs of proximity to unseen worlds. A child who died was not thought to leave cleanly. Death in childhood was tragically common. Illness, infection, malnutrition, sudden fevers. Children slipped away quickly, often in their sleep. Parents would lay them down breathing and find them cold by morning. This blurred the line between sleep and death until it nearly vanished. A child did not die. They failed to wake. And if they failed to wake once, what stopped them from waking again? Many cultures believed that children who died were especially likely to return, not as monsters, but as restless sleepers, crying spirits, wandering dreams. Their deaths felt unfinished. They had not lived enough to detach from the world. Their souls, like their bodies, were thought to still need comfort, guidance, reassurance. The lullaby was meant to provide that, but not in the way we might hope. These songs were not invitations to peace, they were restraints. The lyrics, where decipherable, are repetitive to the point of obsession. Sleep now. Lie still. Do not rise. The night is deep. The world is quiet. Stay where you are. Over and over again, the same commands wrapped in gentle language, comfort masking control. The tablet was not meant for the living to read. It was meant for the dead child to hear. Ancient people believed that sound lingered, that words, once shaped, could continue to exist without a speaker. By engraving the lullaby into clay, they made it permanent. The song would never end. The child would never reach the final note that signals waking. This belief rests on a terrifying assumption that the dead child could still hear. And not only hear, but be soothed or restrained by familiar sounds. Sleep for children was already a liminal state. They slipped into it easily and emerged unpredictably. A sleeping child looked eerily like a dead one, still, quiet, breath shallow. Parents watched chests rise and fall in the dark, afraid of what they might find by morning. When death occurred, it felt like an extension of sleep, rather than a separate event. The lullaby was an attempt to continue parenting beyond the grave. Do not wake. Do not cry. Do not come back. Some tablets include instructions directed not at the child, but at the night itself. Stay calm. Be gentle. Do not frighten the small one. This suggests that sleep was not trusted even after death. Night was a force that could disturb the dead child, just as it disturbed the living one. In these cultures, dreams were not internal experiences. They were places children wandered into, guided by voices, lights, shadows. A dead child trapped in endless sleep might still dream, and dreams, as many believed, could spill outward. A child's nightmare was especially dangerous. Children were thought to dream more vividly than adults. Their minds were unguarded. Their dreams could take shape, gain weight, slip free. A dead child dreaming endlessly underground might release those dreams into the world above, manifesting as unexplained crying, sickness, or bad luck. The lullaby kept the dream gentle. It kept the child calm. It kept the dreams from turning sharp. Placement of the tablets reinforces this interpretation. They are often found near the head, sometimes beneath it, as though forming a pillow of words. In some cases, the tablet is angled toward the ear, suggesting it was meant to be heard. This is not symbolic, it is practical within the belief system. The song had to reach the child. Some tablets show fingerprints in the clay left by whoever engraved them. The lines are uneven. The pressure varies. These are not professional scribes. These are parents, caregivers. Hands shaking, working quickly before the clay dried, before the burial had to take place. Grief pressed into earth. Yet grief alone does not explain the content of the songs. The emphasis is not on reunion or love. It is on stillness, on staying asleep, on not returning. The tenderness is real, but it is laced with fear. Ancient parents loved their children deeply, but they also feared them in death. A child who died could become a spirit who cried at night, who tugged at the dreams of the living, who demanded attention endlessly because they never learned how to let go. The lullaby taught them to let go, or at least to stop trying. In some cultures, these tablets were broken intentionally before burial, then reassembled near the body. This act symbolized finality. The song was complete. There would be no new verses, no changes. The child's world was fixed. Other tablets were left intact but sealed inside containers, protecting the song from interference. No one was allowed to speak it aloud again. To do so might wake the child or remind them of the world they left. Silence was part of the ritual. What makes these finds especially haunting is how familiar they feel. The words may be ancient, the symbols strange, but the concept is instantly recognizable. Parents today still sing to children to calm them, to stop crying, to ease fear, to encourage sleep. The difference is duration. These lullabies were not meant to end. They were meant to replace waking forever. Some tablets include references to darkness as a friend, night as a blanket, earth as a bed. The grave is softened linguistically, transformed into a place of rest rather than confinement. This reframing was necessary. To imagine a child trapped underground without comfort was unbearable. The song made the grave a bedroom. But bedrooms are places you wake up from, unless you are told not to. The repetition in the song serves a psychological function we still understand today. Repetition calms. Predictability soothes. The same words, the same rhythm again and again until consciousness fades. These lullabies were engineered to pacify. Not just the child, the parents too. Knowing the song was there, continuing in silence, gave survivors a sense of control. The child was not alone. The child was not wandering. The child was sleeping, deeply, safely, and not coming back. There is an unspoken terror beneath all of this, the fear of hearing a child cry after burial. Many ancient stories describe exactly that. Wails from the earth, sounds at night, parents rushing to graves in panic. The lullaby was preventative medicine. If the child never woke, they would never cry. The tablet was a promise. When archaeologists hold these objects today, the weight is not just physical. It is emotional. Each line pressed into clay represents a choice, to soothe instead of summon, to silence instead of risk. Love shaped by terror, children buried with lullabies remind us that ancient people understood sleep not as innocence, but as power. Sleep carried the risk of movement between worlds. For children who already moved so freely between waking and dreaming, that risk was magnified. Death did not end that movement, so the song continued, soft, endless, unchanging, to keep the child asleep forever. The stone was placed carefully, deliberately, with a weight that could not be accidental. It rested squarely on the chest, pressing down on ribs that would one day collapse inward, pinning the body to the earth as surely as the soil itself. In some graves there was one stone, in others several stacked with purpose. The intention was unmistakable. Whatever lay beneath was not meant to rise. Archaeologists encounter these burials again and again across different regions and eras, often in places far removed from one another, yet bound by the same logic. Bodies laid out properly, wrapped or shrouded, and then restrained. Heavy stone slabs or boulders placed directly over the torso, sometimes the neck, sometimes the limbs, but most often the chest. This was not random waiting to keep animals away. It was targeted. The chest mattered to ancient people. The chest was the seat of breath, and breath was life. Breath left the body at death, but many believed it could return. The last breath lingered, it hovered. It waited. If it found its way back into the body, the dead might stir. The stone prevented that. Pin the chest and you pin the breath, and the dead stay still. Sleep again sits at the center of this fear. Death was frequently described not as an ending but as a deep sleep. The dead lay as sleepers lay, on their backs, eyes closed, unmoving. And just as sleepers sometimes woke suddenly in the night, so too might the dead. The possibility haunted ancient communities. Stories circulated of corpses found shifted in their graves, of coffins scratched from within, of shapes seen standing at the edges of villages before dawn. Whether these stories were true mattered less than how they felt. They felt possible. The stone was insurance. Many of the bodies buried with chest weights show no signs of honor or reverence. These are not ceremonial monuments. They are practical solutions. The stones are rough, uncarved, taken from nearby fields or riverbeds. They were chosen for mass, not beauty. This was not about symbolism alone. It was about physics. If the dead tried to sit up, they would fail. If they tried to breathe deeply, they would struggle. If they tried to rise, they would be crushed back down. The act implies a belief that the dead retained agency, that they could attempt to move. That death did not rob the body of intention, only of strength. The stone supplied that final imbalance. In some graves, the rib cages beneath the stones are visibly deformed, flattened beyond what natural decay would cause. The weight was heavy enough to reshape bone over time. This suggests the stones were placed immediately after burial, before decomposition weakened the body. The living wanted the restraint in place while the body was still whole. They feared the first nights most of all. The idea of the dead rising at night is ancient and widespread. Night is when the boundary between worlds thins. Shadows move. Familiar shapes become strange. Dreams bleed into waking. If the dead were to move, night was when it would happen. Sleep again mirrors death. The living lie down, surrender control, and enter darkness. The dead lie down and never wake, or so people hoped. But hope was not enough. Stone weights appear most often in burials of individuals who were considered dangerous in life or death. Those accused of crimes, outsiders, people who died violently, suddenly, or under suspicious circumstances, those who suffered from strange illnesses, seizures, visions, or uncontrollable sleep. Anyone whose body or mind behaved unpredictably was a candidate for restraint. The community could not risk uncertainty. There are also cases where children or otherwise innocuous individuals were buried this way, which complicates the picture. In these cases, fear was not moral but existential. Sudden death itself was dangerous. Anyone who died wrong might come back wrong. The stone did not judge, it prevented. In some cultures, the stone was believed to mimic the weight of the earth itself, accelerating the dead's acceptance of stillness. The pressure reminded the body that it belonged below, not above. The earth pressed down from all sides, but the chest stone made that pressure immediate and undeniable. It forced submission. The chest is also where emotion was believed to reside in many ancient belief systems. Fear, anger, longing, all lived there. A restless spirit was thought to be driven by unresolved emotion. By crushing the chest, those emotions were neutralized. The dead could not feel strongly enough to rise. This belief is reflected in myths where spirits are described as heavy, slow, bound by grief or rage. Weight equaled control. The placement of stones often coincided with other preventative measures. Bodies buried face down, heads separated or turned, limbs bound, mouths filled with objects. Each measure addressed a different fear. Together, they formed a system of containment. The chest stone addressed the most basic one: movement. What is striking is how methodical these burials are. The stone is centered, balanced, sometimes supported by smaller rocks to prevent rolling. This was not panic, it was procedure. Communities had learned what worked. In some burial grounds, only certain graves contained chest stones, indicating selective use. In others, nearly every body is weighted. This suggests periods of heightened fear, plagues, famines, wars, when death felt unstable, when too many people died too quickly, without the proper rituals to ease their transition. In those times, everyone was a risk. Sleep deprivation, illness, and grief all increase hallucinations, nightmares, and sleep paralysis. Ancient people living through crisis likely experienced a surge in night terrors. They dreamed of the dead, they saw faces in the dark. They felt presences pressing on their chests as they slept. The parallels are impossible to ignore. The dead were blamed for these sensations. The stone was the response. There is a cruel logic to it. If people felt pressure on their chests at night, something must be pressing on them. If the dead lay beneath the earth, perhaps they were pushing upward. The stone pushed back. This interpretation reveals how closely sleep experiences influenced burial practices. The feeling of being pinned during sleep paralysis, of something heavy sitting on the chest, may have reinforced the belief that weight controls movement between worlds. If weight immobilizes the living sleeper, it would immobilize the dead as well. The stone became a universal solution. Some stones bear markings or carvings, not decorative but symbolic. Lines, crosses, circles, signs meant to reinforce the restraint spiritually as well as physically. In these cases, the stone did double duty, mass and meaning. Others are completely unmarked, emphasizing function over ritual. In graves where multiple stones are used, they are often arranged in patterns that distribute weight evenly. The goal was not to crush randomly, but to ensure complete immobilization. The dead should not even be able to roll. Imagine the psychological impact of preparing such a burial. The living handle the body of someone they knew, someone they may have loved, and then deliberately restrain it, pin it, deny it the dignity of rest. This act requires fear stronger than grief. It suggests that the fear was justified in their minds. Stories of the dead rising were not entertainment. They were warnings. A body that rose threatened the entire community. Disease, misfortune, madness, all were blamed on restless dead. The stone was cheaper than exile, easier than relocation, more reliable than prayer. It was permanent. In some cultures, stones were removed after a set period, once the body was believed to have fully decayed and the spirit settled. In others, the stone was never to be touched again. Disturbing it could reawaken what it restrained. This created a long-lasting taboo around graves with chest stones. People avoided them. Children were warned away. Even centuries later, When the belief faded, the avoidance lingered. The stones worked not just physically, but psychologically. Modern archaeologists often note that these burials feel different to excavate. The presence of the stone changes the posture of the remains. The skeleton seems pressed into itself, defensive, constrained. It does not look like rest, it looks like captivity. The idea that the dead might rise during the night reveals a profound anxiety about the boundary between stillness and motion. Sleep blurs that boundary. So does death. The two states mirror each other too closely for comfort. If a sleeping person can wake, then perhaps a dead one can too. The stone was meant to break that symmetry. By anchoring the dead to the earth, ancient people tried to enforce a difference between sleep and death. Sleep ends. Death does not, or at least, should not. Stone weights on chests are silent testimonies to nights filled with fear, to communities listening for footsteps that should never come, to people lying awake wondering if the ground beneath them was truly still. They placed the stone and hoped, and for the most part, the dead stayed down. The chamber was not shaped like a grave, it was shaped like a room. The walls were smooth, sometimes plastered, sometimes painted. The floor was level, occasionally lined with mats, stone slabs, or carefully arranged pebbles. There was space around the body, not the tight compression of a coffin or pit, but the deliberate allowance of comfort. In some cases there were niches, shelves, even what appeared to be headrests or platforms aligned exactly where a pillow would go. This was not a place to dispose of the dead. It was a place to lay someone down. Archaeologists standing inside these spaces often describe the same unsettling feeling, the sense that they are intruding into a bedroom rather than excavating a tomb. The proportions are wrong for storage. Too careful, too intimate. The dead were not treated as remains. They were treated as sleepers. Across multiple ancient cultures, graves were designed to resemble domestic sleeping spaces. Bodies were positioned on their sides or backs in postures identical to sleep, arms folded gently, heads supported. In some chambers, light shafts were engineered to allow a soft glow at certain times of day, mimicking dawn or dusk. In others, the chambers were sealed entirely, plunged into permanent night. Either way, the intention was clear. Death was not framed as departure, but as a state of rest that required management. Sleep was never neutral in ancient belief systems. It was powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. It took consciousness away while leaving the body present. It mimicked death too closely to be trusted. People watched sleepers breathe. They feared silence. They whispered names to ensure loved ones were still there. When someone died, especially peacefully, especially in their sleep, the distinction vanished. The sleep chamber grave reflects this ambiguity. The dead were not gone. They were sleeping differently, and that difference mattered. If death was sleep, then all the dangers of sleep applied, only amplified. Sleep allowed dreams. Dreams allowed wandering. Wandering allowed return. A dead sleeper might wake confused, disoriented, driven by habit to rise, walk, speak. The chamber had to prevent that. That is why these graves look like bedrooms but function like traps. Some chambers include low ceilings, making it impossible for a body to sit up fully. Others have sloped floors that subtly pull the body back toward the center. Walls are close enough to limit movement, but far enough to avoid the appearance of confinement. The illusion of comfort masks containment. It is sleep architecture designed to keep someone asleep. Objects found within these chambers reinforce the idea. Lamps placed near the head but sealed so they could never be lit. Cups and bowls carved from stone, permanently empty. Textiles arranged as if to cover, but too stiff to move. Everything looks familiar, but nothing functions. This is a room that pretends to be alive while ensuring stillness. The belief behind these chambers is not that the dead need comfort for their own sake. It is that the dead must be kept calm. A calm sleeper does not wake. A disturbed sleeper does. Ancient people paid close attention to how sleepers behaved. Tossing, murmuring, sudden waking, these were signs of internal unrest. In death, unrest was unacceptable. A restless dead person threatened everyone, so the grave became a controlled sleep environment. Noise was minimized. Chambers were often located away from living spaces, sometimes underground, sometimes isolated behind layers of stone. Vibrations were dampened. Light was regulated or eliminated entirely. The dead were insulated from stimulation, as one would soothe an anxious sleeper. The paradox is haunting. The dead were treated with the same care one would give a living person at their most vulnerable, yet that care was motivated by fear, not compassion. Death was not an ending. It was an unstable condition. Sleep chambers also reflect a belief that waking was possible. Not resurrection in a religious sense, but reanimation, confusion, half-life. The dead might wake and not realize they were dead. They might try to return to routine, to home, to family. The chamber intercepted that impulse. Some graves include false doors carved into walls, doors that look real but lead nowhere. These are especially chilling. A sleeper waking in darkness might reach for the door, driven by instinct. The door exists visually but denies escape physically. The dead are given the comfort of familiarity without the danger of freedom. Other chambers include wall paintings depicting night scenes, stars, moons, dark animals. Never day, never sun. This reinforces the idea that the dead should remain in night and sleep. Dawn is absent. Morning is forbidden. Sleep should not end. In cultures that believed the soul lingered near the body, the chamber served as an anchor. The soul, like a dreaming mind, might wander too far if not contained by familiar surroundings. The bedroom-like space gave it something to recognize, something to stay with, but recognition cuts both ways. A sleeper in a familiar room might feel safe enough to wake. That is why these chambers often lack mirrors, reflective surfaces, or anything that would allow self-recognition. The dead were not meant to see themselves. Awareness could trigger awakening. The line between dream and waking was thin. The chamber was designed to keep the dead on one side of it. In some cases, chambers were reused, with new bodies placed in the same sleeping space. This seems to contradict the idea of individual rest, but it supports another belief that sleepers could blend, that multiple dead could share a dream space, reinforcing stillness through collective quiet. Movement would disturb everyone. Silence kept order. Children buried in sleep chambers were often placed in smaller, more enclosed rooms, mimicking cradles or shared sleeping spaces. Adults were given more room, but never enough to forget they were confined. The scale always communicates restraint disguised as care. The chambers also tell us something about how ancient people viewed consciousness. Waking was not simply opening the eyes. It was a state triggered by stimuli, light, sound, familiarity, emotion. Remove those and waking becomes unlikely. The dead were treated like sleepers in need of perfect conditions to never wake again. This worldview was reinforced by lived experience. People saw sleepers wake suddenly in panic. They saw sleepwalkers move with empty eyes. They experienced sleep paralysis, where the body lies still but the mind screams awake. These states blurred the categories of alive, asleep, and dead until the distinctions collapsed. If a living person could behave like a corpse, why couldn't a corpse behave like a living person? The sleep chamber is an answer to that question. It is an architectural reassurance, a way to say we have thought about this. We have prepared for it. The dead will stay where they are, yet the very existence of these chambers reveals doubt. Absolute confidence would require no such measures. You do not child-proof a house unless you believe the child can move. You do not design a grave like a bedroom unless you believe the sleeper might wake. The dead were not inert objects. They were potential actors. Modern observers often romanticize these chambers, seeing them as expressions of tenderness, of a desire to make death peaceful. But the details resist that reading. Peace is not engineered so carefully. Peace does not require false doors like control, movement restriction. These are safety features. The dead were being managed. Sleep chambers, not tombs. tell us that ancient people lived with constant awareness of liminal states, sleep, trance, dream. None of these were stable. All of them involved crossing boundaries that might not hold. The grave became a controlled environment for a dangerous condition. To die was to enter a sleep too deep to trust. So the living built rooms to keep the dead dreaming quietly, indefinitely, without ever reaching the moment when dreams turn into waking. Because waking in death was the one thing they feared most. The jar was sealed so tightly that it took tools to open it. Its lid had been fused with resin, clay, sometimes even wax mixed with ash or hair. It was never meant to be opened again. When archaeologists found these vessels beside ancient beds, beneath sleeping platforms, or tucked into the corners of domestic spaces, they first assumed they were storage containers for food, oil, herbs. But the contents told a different story. Many were empty. Others contained nothing but dust, scraps of fabric, twisted fibers, or objects too small and symbolic to serve any practical purpose. These were not containers for things you needed. They were containers for things you feared. Dream jars appear in the archaeological record as quiet, domestic objects, but their placement is deliberate and intimate. They are found where people slept, near the head, near the chest, sometimes directly under the bed, hidden from sight but close enough to matter. Unlike grave goods or ritual offerings, these jars belonged to the living. They were part of the nightly routine. Their purpose was to trap nightmares before sleep. Ancient people did not believe nightmares originated solely inside the mind. Dreams were not private events. They were encounters. Forces that came from outside, slipped into the body, and left marks behind. A nightmare was something that attacked you while you were vulnerable. If it could enter, it could be stopped. The jar was the stop. Before lying down to sleep, a person might whisper into the vessel, breathe into it, or leave it open for a time. The belief was that nightmares wandered at night, searching for entry. The jar acted as a decoy, a hollow space that attracted them. Once inside, the vessel was sealed, trapping the nightmare before it could reach the sleeper. This belief reveals a profound anxiety about sleep itself. Sleep was necessary, but dangerous. You could not remain awake forever. The body demanded rest, but rest meant exposure. The dream jar was a compromise, an attempt to sleep safely in a world that felt hostile after dark. The jars vary widely in size and material. Some are small, no larger than a fist, easily hidden or carried. Others are larger, heavy vessels that would remain stationary beside a bed for years. Clay is the most common material, but stone, wood, and even metal appear in some cultures. What matters is not durability alone, but containment. The jar must hold what it captures. Many jars are marked with symbols that suggest closure and repetition: circles, knots, spirals, labyrinthine patterns. These designs are not decorative. They are instructions. Once something enters, it cannot find its way out. The nightmare will wander inside the jar endlessly, lost, unable to return to the world. Some jars are deliberately imperfect, cracks sealed with resin, uneven rims, asymmetrical shapes. These flaws were believed to confuse nightmares, making the vessel more attractive. A nightmare, like a predator, would choose the easiest entry. The jar offered it willingly. The belief that nightmares could be tricked is telling. It suggests that they were thought to have intention, but limited intelligence. Dangerous, but manageable. With the right tools, they could be outwitted. In some households, dream jars were communal. One jar protected multiple sleepers. In others, each person had their own. Children often had smaller jars placed closer to them, reflecting the belief that they were more vulnerable to nightmares. Their minds were open. Their dreams were wild. They needed extra protection. The contents of some jars are especially disturbing. Archaeologists have found strands of hair, nail clippings, scraps of clothing, even teeth sealed inside. These were not offerings. They were lures. Personal items connected to the sleeper made the jar more convincing to a nightmare. The nightmare would mistake the jar for the person. Enter here, not there. This practice reveals how externalized nightmares were. They were not expressions of fear, they were carriers of it. A nightmare could be misdirected, contained, neutralized. Once trapped, the nightmare could not harm anyone. At least, that was the hope. Some cultures believed that dream jars filled over time. Nightmares accumulated, growing restless, dangerous. This is why many jars were buried, broken, or sealed permanently after a period of use. You could not release what you captured. You had to dispose of it safely. Burial was common. The jar was placed underground, often at crossroads, boundaries, or far from the home. Nightmares belonged to liminal spaces. They should not remain near the living. Breaking the jar was risky. If done incorrectly, it could release everything at once. The fact that these jars existed at all tells us how seriously ancient people took sleep-related terror. Nightmares were not occasional disturbances. They were threats that required physical countermeasures. People adjusted their environments, crafted tools, and developed rituals around the act of sleeping. Sleep was a battleground. Many dream jars are found alongside beds that show signs of long-term use. This was not a temporary solution. It was a lifestyle. Each night the jar stood guard. Each morning it remained sealed, heavy with whatever it had captured. Some jars were believed to hum faintly at night or grow warm. Others were said to cause headaches or unease if kept too long. These sensations reinforced belief in their contents. If you slept better with the jar present, it worked. If nightmares returned after it broke, that confirmed everything. The psychological reinforcement was powerful. Interestingly, dream jars are often found in cultures that also feared dreams escaping the dead. The logic is consistent. Dreams are mobile. They do not respect bodies, living or dead. If they can wander, they must be managed. The jar became a portable prison. Placement near the bed is crucial. The nightmare must encounter the jar before the sleeper. Distance mattered. A jar placed too far away would fail. Some were even embedded into bed frames or sleeping platforms, ensuring proximity. This intimate integration into daily life shows how normalized the fear was. People did not question whether nightmares existed. They questioned how best to catch them. Some jars include inscriptions that resemble commands rather than prayers. Stay here, enter and remain, do not pass. These are not pleas to gods. They are instructions to the nightmare itself. That implies negotiation. Nightmares were not omnipotent. They followed rules. In certain traditions, dream jars were refreshed regularly, opened briefly during the day when nightmares were believed to be dormant, then resealed at dusk. This daily rhythm mirrors sleep itself. Nightmares belonged to the night. Daylight weakened them, light mattered. Jars were often kept in shadowed areas, reinforcing their function as nocturnal tools. Children were taught not to touch the jars. To knock one over was dangerous. It might spill something invisible. Fear was woven into upbringing. Sleep safety was learned behavior. The jars also reflect communal understanding of mental distress. Without language for anxiety, trauma, or neurological phenomena, people externalized their experiences. If someone suffered repeated nightmares, the solution was not introspection but protection. Get a better jar. Use stronger seals. Add more lures. Blame shifted away from the individual and onto the environment. This may have been comforting, but it also meant that fear never disappeared. It was managed, not resolved. Dream jars are ancestors of many later protective objects, dream catchers, talismans, night charms. The concept persists: filter the bad, let the good pass. The difference is that dream jars did not filter. They trapped. Nothing escaped. Some archaeologists speculate that jars were also used during waking hallucinations or sleep paralysis episodes. A person experiencing terror at night might clutch the jar, believing it contained the threat. The physical object anchored them, gave fear a location. Fear is easier to face when it has a container. Over time, the jar itself became charged with anxiety. To see it was to remember why it existed. The object carried the fear so the mind did not have to. In homes where multiple jars were found, It suggests prolonged periods of unrest, illness, grief, instability. Nightmares thrive in such conditions. The jars multiplied as defenses escalated. Eventually, some jars were buried with their owners, not as grave goods, but as final containment. The nightmares belonged to them. Better to keep them sealed than risk release. This blurs the line between protecting the living and managing the dead. Dream jars sit at the intersection of sleep, fear, and control. They are humble objects with a terrifying purpose. They acknowledge that the mind is not fully sovereign during sleep, that something else takes over. Rather than deny that truth, ancient people built vessels to contain it. When you look at these jars today, empty and silent, it is tempting to dismiss them as superstition. But they are evidence of something deeply human: the need to sleep, and the fear of what happens when you do. The jar stands beside the bed, sealed, waiting, and the sleeper lies down, hoping it works. The skull lies tilted slightly upward, jaw stretched wide, teeth bared not in decay but in something that looks unmistakably like a scream. When archaeologists first uncover remains like these, the reaction is almost always visceral. Bones are expected to be silent, neutral, emptied of emotion. But a mouth frozen open violates that expectation. It looks like a moment interrupted, a sound cut off mid-breath, an ending that did not arrive gently. These skeletons appear across burial sites worldwide, spanning eras and cultures that shared no language, no contact, no unified belief system. And yet the image repeats: gaping mouths, rigid jaws, necks strained as if the head were pulled back in shock. The position suggests more than natural decomposition. It suggests awareness. The human mouth opens in sleep only briefly and reflexively. It opens wide in moments of intense emotion, pain, terror, panic, sudden awakening. A scream is not a passive act. It is a response to something perceived as immediate and overwhelming. When a skeleton appears locked in that posture, the implication is chilling. Whatever happened fast, and it happened while consciousness was still present. For ancient people, this posture carried enormous meaning. Death was not always assumed to be peaceful. In fact, sudden death was deeply unsettling. To die quietly, eyes closed, mouth relaxed, resembled sleep. To die with the mouth open shattered that illusion. It suggested interruption rather than transition. Sleep again becomes central. Many of these skeletons are found in contexts where death likely occurred during rest: beds, sleeping chambers, domestic spaces, or graves arranged in sleeping postures. The body lies as though asleep, but the face tells a different story. Something went wrong. Something woke them. The fear embedded in this image is not just about pain. It is about the moment of realization. The instant when a sleeper becomes aware that something is wrong and does not have time to escape. Ancient cultures feared death that arrived mid-sleep because it implied vulnerability taken advantage of. Night was already dangerous. To be attacked, suffocated, possessed, or overtaken while asleep confirmed the belief that sleep opened the body to intrusion. A skeleton mid-scream seemed to prove that fear. The mouth is also where breath enters and leaves the body. Breath was life. To die with the mouth open implied a final, desperate attempt to draw breath, or to expel something. Some cultures believed the soul left through the mouth. A wide open jaw might mean the soul fled suddenly, violently torn out rather than gently departing. That kind of departure was not safe. Souls that left in panic were believed to linger. The scream mattered because it suggested unfinished business. A person who died peacefully went where they were supposed to go. A person who died screaming might remain trapped between states, awake but bodiless, restless and angry. Archaeologists often caution against reading emotion into skeletal remains. Jaw position can be affected by decomposition, muscle relaxation, gravity. But the frequency and context of these open-mouthed skeletons complicates that explanation. Many are found with jaws held open unnaturally wide, sometimes dislocated, sometimes supported by surrounding sediment as though frozen in that position immediately after death. In some cases, the mouth contains foreign objects, Soil packed deeply inside, small stones, cloth remnants. This suggests the mouth was open when burial occurred, not opened later by decay. The living encountered the body with the mouth already agape. They buried it that way, which means they saw it, and they chose not to close it. That choice is significant. Closing the mouth was a common funerary act in many cultures, associated with sealing the soul, granting peace, restoring dignity. Leaving it open was deliberate. The scream was allowed to persist. Why? In some belief systems, the open mouth was a warning. It showed that death had not come gently. It marked the individual as dangerous, unsettled, or unfinished. Others would know to be cautious. The dead person's final expression became a sign. In other cases, the open mouth was containment. A scream trapped in bone could not escape into the world. The terror stayed with the body, rather than spreading through dreams or haunting the living. The scream was sealed in the skeleton. Sleep-related explanations deepen this interpretation. Many people experience hypnagogic hallucinations, waking suddenly from sleep with the sensation of falling, choking, or being attacked. The body reacts violently, gasping, screaming, heart racing. If death occurred during such an episode through heart failure, stroke, suffocation, the final posture could indeed reflect terror rather than calm. Ancient people did not know this medically. They knew it experientially. They knew what it felt like to wake in terror. They knew that sleep could turn suddenly against you. Skeletons mid-scream seemed to confirm that the dead had woken at the worst possible moment. There is also a connection to sleep paralysis. People who experience it often report trying to scream but being unable to produce sound. The mouth opens. The jaw strains. The body remains frozen. If death occurred during paralysis, due to fear-induced cardiac events or respiratory failure, the posture could remain. From an ancient perspective, this would look like a person waking, seeing something unbearable, and being silenced before they could escape. The scream never came out. It stayed in the bones. Some burial sites show attempts to control this expression. Stones placed under the jaw, bindings around the head, cloth stuffed into the mouth after death. These actions suggest that an open mouth was seen as dangerous even after life ended. A scream could continue in other ways, through breathless whispers, dreams, hauntings. Silencing the mouth was an act of protection. But when skeletons are found without such measures, it implies either that death was too sudden for ritual correction, or that the scream itself served a purpose. In plague burials, for example, skeletons mid-scream appear frequently. Entire communities died too fast to manage each body properly. Fear was everywhere. Dreams were disturbed. Sleep was broken. People expected the dead to be restless because they had not been properly settled. The open mouths in these graves reflect that chaos. They are not just individual deaths. They are collective panic made visible. In some cultures, a person who died screaming was believed to carry their terror into the afterlife, infecting others. These dead might appear in dreams, mouths open, repeating the final moment endlessly. The scream became a loop. This belief reinforced fear of sudden awakening at death, to die without time to prepare. To wake and realize you are dying was the worst possible fate. Sleep was supposed to protect you from awareness. Death during sleep was supposed to be merciful. Skeletons mid-scream shattered that hope. They suggested that even sleep could betray you. The image also taps into a deeper psychological fear, the fear of realizing too late. Many nightmares revolve around delayed awareness, realizing you are falling, drowning, trapped, or dying only when escape is impossible. A scream is the body's last attempt to assert control. When that scream is frozen in bone, it becomes a monument to helplessness. Ancient observers would have read these remains as evidence that something went wrong cosmically, not just physically. The dead had crossed over badly. They might need special handling. Their graves might need reinforcement. Their names might need to be avoided. The mouth told the story. In some burial traditions, skeletons with open mouths are found isolated or marked differently, suggesting social stigma even in death. These individuals were dangerous reminders that death was not always gentle. In others, the open mouth is framed deliberately, aligned upward, unobstructed, as though the scream were meant to be seen by whatever lay above. A final accusation directed at the sky, the gods, fate itself. Sleep again underlies this drama. The transition from unconsciousness to awareness is abrupt and disorienting. To wake and immediately face death is to experience that transition at its most violent. The scream marks the collision between sleep and mortality. Modern viewers feel unsettled by these skeletons because we recognize that collision. We have all woken suddenly in panic. We know the sensation. The bones reflect it back to us across time. Whether these individuals died from illness, violence, suffocation, or sudden internal failure matters less than how their deaths were interpreted. The open mouth was not neutral. It was meaningful. It said, "This person knew," and knowing in death was dangerous. Skeletons mid-scream remind us that ancient people feared not just dying, but waking up while dying. They feared awareness without agency. They feared the moment when sleep ends and terror begins. The scream frozen in bone is that moment preserved. It is not proof of haunting. It is proof of fear, and it tells us that for as long as humans have slept, they have worried about what might wake them in the dark, and whether they would survive the awakening. All of these discoveries point to the same unsettling truth for ancient people. Sleep was never harmless, and death was never simply an end. The boundary between resting, dreaming, waking, and dying was thin, unstable, and terrifying. Graves faced away from dawn, bells placed in rigid hands, stones crushing chests, eyes forced open, lullabies sealed in clay, jars waiting to trap nightmares. All of them reveal a shared fear that the dead were not fully gone, only sleeping in a way that could turn dangerous. Sleep was treated as a liminal state, a crossing point where the soul could wander, where awareness might flicker back on, where something unseen could intrude. Death, then, was understood as the deepest and most perilous sleep of all. If sleep could betray the living with paralysis, nightmares, sudden terror, and false awakenings, why would death be any safer? These rituals were not acts of ignorance or cruelty. They were systems of control, attempts to manage uncertainty in a world where consciousness could slip away and return without warning. What haunts us most is how familiar these fears still feel. We still speak of being haunted by dreams of restless nights, of not finding peace. We still associate sleep with vulnerability and rest with something that must be earned, protected, preserved. The language survives even if the rituals have changed. In the end, all these practices circle the same desire to ensure stillness, to prevent disturbance, to grant a state of rest that would not turn against the living, not awakening, not wandering, not returning, just calm, just rest, just sleep, just peace, just slumber, just repose, just eternal stillness.